So the last part here we're going to take a look at is Washington's farewell address and then what happens with the Adams presidency as well. And what's very interesting is that Washington's got a bit of a dilemma on his hands, and there is nothing at this point in the Constitution that says that a president can't continue to run on a third, fourth, fifth, or however many terms that he wants. And Washington knows that he could very well easily be unanimously elected once again. However, he refuses to serve a third term. And the reason for this is, again, remember the context of where we are. The colonial Americans have just broken away from England because of what they feared to be a tyrant king of England. They do not want a tyrant president of the United States, and Washington knows this. So again, that P word, precedent, is what he's setting up here as a way to stop after 2 terms, and most presidents will hold to this until we get to FDR during the 1940s. Washington's farewell address, which we will go through and we'll talk about in class, there's a couple things that he warns against. He warns against sectionalism, and this is very easily able to be seen today if you've paid attention at all to the way politics is moving, to where the left and the right are both at each other's throats constantly. This tribal sectionalism where your side is absolutely right and the other side is absolutely wrong. In this case, we're talking about North versus South. Today we would say left versus right or Republican versus Democrat. And he also is warning against secession or seceding from the United States, and we'll see where that does become an issue, not just from the Civil War, but even from the Hartford Convention, where certain states in New England want to secede because they're unhappy about the way the War of 1812 was handled. He's going to warn against political parties. He believes that is a way to kind of promote sectionalism and promote division amongst the Americans, which he believes strongly against. He also warns that we should stay away from entangling alliances. We should not have a committed alliance permanently that we get sucked into their wars as well, that we should more have temporary alliances, more pragmatic alliances where if you are benefiting us, we will be in alliance to you, but when you're not, we're not going to be in alliance with you because you're not helping the United States. Okay, it's a very isolated way of being. Washington is a very isolational president. And this will basically set the precedent for foreign policy for much of the 1800s. So let's go to the election of 1796. And the problem, even though Alexander Hamilton was supposed to be the chosen one, he had made way too many enemies because of his financial plan and his brashness, we'll say, with handling the Jeffersonian Republicans. So that goes to frontrunner then John Adams of the Federalist Party. John Adams is a very qualified but unpopular, rough personality, especially amongst the southern populations. He was suspected to favor more of a monarchical type of government. They believe that Adams was actually more of a British sympathizer than anything because of his role during the Boston Massacre as a lawyer for the British soldiers, and also he tends to want a very strong central power. Hamilton and Adams hate each other, which divided the party. So that, much like we'll see throughout the course, when a party fractions at times, it does hinder their ability to do well in elections. On the flip side of this, we have the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, who will use the Whiskey Rebellion and Jay's Treaty against the Federalists to gain support in the middle and southern colonies. The campaign becomes very personal and nasty, much like we see politics today, where candidates are accusing things of each other, yelling at each other through the press, calling each other vile names. And 1796 is much like this. Now, Adams will become successful. He will become the second president. You can see here on the map here in the Electoral College, it was very close. You can see the sectionalism that Washington's talking about, where most of the northern and then even the eastern shore, where colonial trade mostly happens, is shifting for Adams, while the southern and western parts of the state of the country are going for Jefferson. And you can see here there's a very close election, but Adams will get the final few votes for the majority. So let's go ahead and get into the bulk of Adams' one term as president, and let's go ahead and just remind ourselves that during this time period, there's a huge problem with France and England, who are at war with one another. Both sides are impressing American sailors or American merchants, or imprisoning them, and the United States is doing everything they can to not go to another war with Europe. And it's going to start here with the XYZ affair. And the gist of what happens here in the XYZ affair is that Adams sends 3 diplomats to go to France and to try to improve relations with their foreign minister, who was named Talleyrand. And Talleyrand was known as a corrupt official, and he actually sends his own officials to bribe the Americans, where they basically have to pay a certain amount and take responsibility for what's taking place. The American ministers rightly refuse to pay, and they return home, and it's kind of seen as a slap in the face, an American foreign policy from the French. They would try to bribe us. And this is going to set up the quasi-war, unofficial war with France that we have for a 2-year span here from 1798 to 1800, where the U.S. and France are going to go through a few naval battles, with the U.S. who wins most of them. It turns out to not be really anything more. Once Napoleon becomes dictator of France in 1800, he will get back to having a diplomatic relationship with the United States, but it does end with all treaties with France to be null and void, or not to be in place anymore. And the policy with France is going to come to a halt once Napoleon does take power. Remember, he wants to control most of Western and Eastern Europe, so he's focusing more on that. So he basically turns a blind eye. He does not care about what's happening with the United States here in the New World. So let's go ahead and look at one of the key controversial parts of John Adams' presidency, and that is going to be the Alien and Sedition Acts. And this is going to be something that actually scars the Federalists moving forward. But if we flip back to 1796 election, we can remember that it was a very nasty election. The Democratic Republicans and the Federalists do not get along. The leader of the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson, is not a friend whatsoever with John Adams. They go back and forth constantly, and we can kind of see why the Alien Sedition Acts are going to be passed as a way to kind of silence or minimize those Jeffersonian Republicans. Now, the first part of this Alien Sedition Act is the Alien Acts, and talking about people who are not native or American citizens quite yet. And it basically, if you're not somebody who has been living here for at least 5 years, the president has given power to deport foreigners at any time, in peace or in war. Now, the sedition part of that really holds true to violate the First Amendment completely. If we look here, anyone who can impede the policies of government or falsely defame government officials, including the president, could be fined or imprisoned. So if you go around talking badly about the president or about somebody in the government, you could be jailed or fined. If you go around and defame them or tell people that they've done something that they haven't, which was very, very common at this time, you could also be imprisoned or fined for that. So a clear violation of the First Amendment and your freedom of speech here with the Alien Sedition Acts. And because of this, a lot of Americans, even in the North, where the Federalists dominate politically, are going to turn against them. So in response to the Alien Sedition Acts, the Democratic Republicans are going to write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, with Jefferson writing the Kentucky and Madison writing the Virginia resolutions. And this is a way to kind of show the fear that the DRs had as far as how much power the federal government was taking with the Alien Sedition Acts. They saw that more freedoms were being taken and that people were getting hampered by this strong central government, which again is the fear of the Democratic Republicans. And in these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, they're trying to explain the states' rights position. Remember, that's a huge component of their platform. And the Democratic Republicans argue that the U.S. was compact, or agreement between the states and national government, so that the federal government was infringing on states' rights. And because of that, they believe that the states should have the right to nullify any law that is deemed unconstitutional, meaning that if Virginia believes that the Alien Sedition Act is unconstitutional, they should not have to follow it and can nullify it or get rid of it. Now, the Federalists are not happy with this. Remember, they are the ones who write up the Alien Sedition Acts. And much like with the Whiskey Rebellion, they don't want the states to criticize and rebel every single time a law is passed that they don't like. They want to keep a strong federal government, a strong federal nation together. The problem is that the only people who have the right to nullify a law is the Supreme Court. And that's what the Federalists are going to argue, that because the whole idea of a judicial branch is to interpret the laws, they are the ones who can nullify a law or deem it unconstitutional, not the states. They don't want the states to have that much power. Eventually, what we'll see is that when the Federalists lose their majority in power, the Alien Citizen Acts will be stripped away by the Democratic Republicans. So just one more time to recap our second main theme here between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. We have these two political parties who are starting to expand, and they're starting to want to fight for power, whether it's Washington and Adams or Jefferson and Madison. And they have two completely views on how the federal government should operate. The Federalists believe that the Constitution was created for us to have a strong central government with small states' rights powers, and that the Constitution should be loosely interpreted, where if something is not in the Constitution, it's implied, because you can't expect a government to write down every single piece of legislation or every single piece of power that is relegated to each particular branch. Remember, they want to kind of promote trade and protection. They want to try to support the merchants and manufacturers of the North, and they want to focus on trade, and they want to focus on building a strong relationship with that of England especially, but also European countries. On the flip side, then, we have the Democratic Republicans, who are mostly anti-federalist, so they're against a strong central government completely. They would support more of a government that was structured under the Articles of Confederation. They appeal more to the middle class, the farmers, the laborers, the small shopkeepers of the southern states. They want a weak central government. They want to make sure a dictator does not come to power, or a tyrant, the same way that King George III went through prior to the American Revolution. They want a bulk of the power to be in the states. They want that the people should restrain the power of politicians, especially of those in Washington. The national debt should be paid off rather than consolidated and maintained. They want to create agrarian or farmer lifestyle. They promote more democratic versus more kind of Republican style of governance. And again, they want to kind of handle things more internally. They want to have not as much industry and trade with the outside world. They're far more isolational in the economic realms than the Federalists. Alright, so that will conclude our discussion here on the aftermath of the Constitution and the presidencies of Washington and Adams. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you in class.